13 Roads. Here is a tale I have not yet forgotten. Crale came to Sennon Hollow to lose his name. The Bone Road gave it back to him. There is a rider on the Bone Road. He carries an iron rod cut with the name of every soul who ever cheated the dead of a debt. When the rider finds you, he does not strike you. He reads your name off the rod, and a name read off that rod stops being a living man's name. You become a debt that has been settled. Crale had spent 9 years selling the dead. He unwrote 200 of them from the debt ledgers for a rich man's coin, and Crale knew his own name had been cut into that iron a long time ago. That is why he ran, far to the north, into a schoolmaster's name and a schoolmaster's smile, hidden in the smallest village he could find. He did not know he had hidden on the Bone Road itself, and the rider had already turned down it and was already coming. I am going to tell you what it read and when. The Bone Road runs through country the maps give up on, a long, carrion-colored track of weathered ivory dust, and the things built along it are not built for the living. Charnel houses, ossuaries with their doors standing open, road shrines stacked, every one of them out of femurs and shin bones gone the color of old butter, raised by hands nobody in living memory has seen at work. The Bone Road has one rule, and the boundary villages teach it to children before the children can walk it. You do not carry a debt to the dead onto the Bone Road, not after dark, not unpaid. It is not a superstition, it is bookkeeping. The dead, you understand, are owed things. They are owed the debts that were never settled, the inheritances that went to the wrong hands, the graves that were dug too shallow, and the names that were struck from the records so a living man could keep what should have passed on. The dead cannot collect these things themselves, so the Bone Road collects for them. The Bone Road sends a rider. Every soul who owes the dead has their name cut into the iron the rider carries, and the rider rides the road at night, and the rider is patient, and the rider is never, ever wrong about who owes what. I have guided 4 travelers down the Bone Road in my time. 3 of them owed nothing, and the road let them by like wind through a fence. The 4th owed a great deal, and I will not tell you tonight what I watched the road take from him, because tonight's tale already has 1 man in it who owed, and 1 is enough for a fire this size. Tonight's man is Crale. He came to Sennon Hollow at the end of harvest on a hired horse with that trunk of books and a letter of introduction in a careful hand that turned out, when anyone thought to check, to have been written by Crale himself. Nobody did think to check. That was the first thing I want you to understand about Crale. He was good. He was not a clumsy liar. He was a patient, smiling, well-spoken liar, the kind that does not get caught because he never asks you to believe anything large. He only ever asked you to believe small things, one at a time, each of them easy, and he let you assemble the lie yourself out of the small, easy pieces, so that afterward it felt like something you had decided rather than something you had been told. He told Sennon Hollow that he was a schoolmaster from the lowland towns who wanted quiet. He told them he had no family. He told them he had always loved the north. 3 small things, all of them easy, not one of them true. The truth, and I have the truth because the Bone Road gave it to me the way it gives me all the truths I bring you. The truth was this. Crale had not been a schoolmaster in the lowlands. Crale had been a clerk, a registrar of the dead in a grey charnel town where the Bone Road begins. And his work, honest work the dead themselves depend on, had been to write the names of the newly dead into the great debt ledgers, so that what each dead man owed and what each dead man was owed could be found and weighed and made right. A man like that holds the only thing the dead have left. Not their money, not their land. The dead do not care about those. A man like that holds their name in the book, their claim, their place in the count, the single line of ink that says, "This person existed and was owed." And Crale, for 9 years, had sold that. It worked like this. A rich man would come to Crale quietly, and the rich man would have a debt, a real one, an ugly one, money owed to someone now dead, or a property that should by every law pass to a dead man's heirs. And the rich man would pay Crale, and Crale would simply not write the dead man's name. He would let the line stay blank. He would let the dead man slip out of the count, unrecorded, unowed to, as though he had never been, and the debt, having no one living to remember it was owed, would quietly die, and the rich man would keep what was never his. Crale did this 9 years. He grew comfortable. He told himself the dead did not mind, because the dead never came to complain. The dead were not complaining. The dead were keeping their own books, and the bone road keeps them with them. He must have felt it start. I think he did. I think that is the real reason he ran. A man who has unwritten 200 dead souls does not wake up one morning and decide, for no reason, to abandon 9 comfortable years and reinvent himself as a poor schoolmaster at the cold far end of the country. Something moved him. I think Crale, in his grey charnel town, began to hear, late on the nights the bone road ran near, the slow sound of a tall, thin horse walking and walking, and never quite arriving. And I think he understood, the way a guilty man always finally understands, that it was walking toward him. So he ran. He took a new name that was almost his old one. He forged himself a kind past, and he chose to hide in the most remote village he could find on the map. He chose Sennan Hollow. He did not understand. He was a charnel town clerk, not a traveller. He had never actually walked the country he kept the books of. He did not understand that Sennan Hollow is not a village near the Bone Road. Sennan Hollow is a village on it. He had run the length of the country to hide, and he had run straight down the throat of the only road in the world built to collect the exact debt he carried. He arrived believing he had escaped. He had simply arrived early. Sennan Hollow took him in without a second look, because Sennan Hollow needed a schoolmaster, and beggars do not inspect the gift horse's letters of introduction. It was a poor, walled, huddled little place, a ring of steep-roofed houses with their backs turned to the Bone Road and their doors all facing inward, the way you would arrange a camp against a thing in the dark. There was a church with no bell. There was a long lane of pollarded trees, and there was, beyond the wall, plainly visible from every upper window, and never once looked at directly by anyone born there, the pale ribbon of the Bone Road running away north into the ossuary country. The children came to Crale's schoolhouse, and he taught them their letters, and he was, I will give him this, a genuinely good teacher. A liar's gifts and a teacher's gifts are nearer than you would like. He was patient. He made the small, hard things feel easy. The children loved him, and the parents were grateful. And by his second week, Crale was eating his supper at a different family's table every night, smiling, careful, listening. Listening, mostly, for one thing. He was listening for who in Sennan Hollow had money. Because Crale had not stopped being what he was. A man does not. He had only changed the town. And the old hunger, the patient, smiling hunger for the thing that belonged to someone else, had made the journey north intact, in the trunk, with the books. By the end of the second week he had his answer, and her name was Katrin Vant. Old Otmar Vant had the only farm in Sennan Hollow that the Bone Road's poverty had not reached. A deep, warm, well-built house with a barn like a chapel, and fields that ran green right up to the pale edge of the bone dust, as though the road itself declined to argue with him. Vant was a widower. Vant had one child. Catherine Vant was not a fool, and I want to be careful to say so, because the tale is about to use her the way the old story always uses the farmer's daughter, as a prize on a shelf. And she deserves better than that, and she was better than that. She was a calm, watchful young woman who had grown up the single heir to the one warm house on a cold road. And she had therefore spent her whole life being courted, and she had grown very good at telling the difference between a man who looked at her and a man who looked at the barn behind her. Crale looked at the barn. Catherine saw him do it. She saw it the first evening across her father's table, saw his careful eyes do the small sum, the daughter plus the farm plus the old man's years, and arrive smiling at a total. She did not refuse him. That is the part the village never understood afterward and judged her for. She did not refuse Crale, and she did not encourage him either. She let him court. She let him come. I have thought about why, and I think the answer is simply that Catherine Vant had been bored her whole life on that warm road, and Crale, lying, hungry, doomed Crale, was the most interesting thing that had ever ridden into Sennon Hollow, and she wanted to watch how it ended. She got her wish. She watched how it ended. I do not think she has been bored since. There was, of course, another man. There is always another man. His name was Bram Holt, and he was everything Crale was not: broad, loud, local, born in Sennon Hollow and never once curious about anywhere else. The best horseman on a road that does not forgive bad horsemen. Bram had wanted to marry Catherine Vant since they were both children. In the uncomplicated way a strong, simple man wants the thing nearest him, and the whole village had long since filed it as settled. Then Crale came, with his books and his lamplight smile and his good, careful talk, and Catherine Vant began visibly to be entertained, and Bram Holt, who had never in his life had to compete for anything because he had never in his life wanted anything that was not simply handed to him, did not know what to do. So he did what that kind of man does. He did not out-talk Crale. He could not. He turned it into sport. He and the other young men of the Hollow began to haunt Crale. Small cruelties, the schoolmaster's saddle loosened, his schoolhouse door nailed shut in the night, his careful clothes mocked in the lane. And Crale, who had survived 9 years of a far more dangerous game by never once losing his temper, only smiled and bore it, and went on courting. The village watched the two men circle the warm farmhouse and thought it was watching the oldest and simplest story there is. The smooth outsider and the rough local, the prize between them. It was not watching that story. There were not two men circling that house. There were two men and a third thing. And the third thing was already on the road, and it did not care which of them Catherine Vant chose, because it had not come for Catherine Vant. It had come, patient and unhurried, and a long 9 years late, for the schoolmaster who used to keep the books. I should tell you about the rider now, the way the village told Crale, because they did tell him, and because the manner of his not listening is the whole of the man. It was Catherine's own father who told him. Old Vant, who liked Crale. Old Vant was the one heart in Sennon Hollow that Crale had won honestly, because a lonely old man and a patient listener are a key and a lock. Old Vant told him on a night near the end of the first month, over the good wine, with the warm fire going, and the door shut against the dark. "You'll have heard," the old man said, "that there's a rider on the Bone Road." Crale smiled and said he had heard something of the kind. "It is not a story," Vant said. "I want you to understand that, because you are not from here, and you have a way of smiling at our stories that the others have started to notice, and I would not have them turn on you. This one is not a story. There is a rider. He comes down the Bone Road at night. He is looking for people who owe a debt to the dead and never paid it. He carries an iron rod, and every name he has ever been sent to collect is cut into that iron. And when he finds you, he does not strike you. He does not need to. He only reads your name off the rod. And a name read off the rod is not a living man's name anymore. You simply are not after. You become a debt that has been settled. And Crale, and here is the man, here is the whole of him in one moment. Crale felt the floor of his stomach drop straight through the warm farmhouse and down 9 years into a grey charnel town. Because of course he knew, he had always known, he had heard the horse walking. Crale felt all of that. And then he smiled, and he refilled the old man's glass, and he said, "Then I am the safest man in Sennon Hollow, for I have never owed anyone anything in my life." He said it to make the old man comfortable. He said it because a smiling denial was the tool that had kept him alive for 9 years, and his hand went to it the way Halls's hand once went to answer a bird. And old Vant laughed and was comforted and let it go. But Katrin was in the room. Katrin was always in the room. And Katrin Vant had watched Crale's face do the whole of it, the drop, the cold, the long fall, before the smile came up over it like a lid coming down over a well. She did not say anything. She had decided by then to watch how it ended. But that was the night she stopped being bored and started, I think, to be afraid. The autumn deepened, and Crale's days stayed bright, and his nights began to go wrong. The days held. He taught, he courted, he was charming at the supper tables, but the nights had started since old Vant's fireside to give him back the thing he had run the length of the country to escape. He would wake in the schoolhouse in the smallest hours and lie still and listen. And out beyond the village wall, faint and even and unhurried, there would be a horse walking the bone road. Walking, never arriving. He told himself, the first nights, that it was the village's stories getting into him, that a man who hears a tale by a fire will hear its horse in every settling timber. He was good at telling himself things, but he was a clerk underneath, and a clerk counts, and Crale could not stop himself counting the nights, and the nights with the horse in them were not getting fewer. And lying there, listening, he did the thing the guilty do in the dark, which is remember. I will give you only one of the memories, because one is enough, and because the bone road gave me this one whole, and I think it was meant to be passed on. There had been, in the grey charnel town, a stonemason. I will not pretend I have his name. Crale himself had worked to make sure no one would. The stonemason had died of the coughing sickness one winter, owed a full year's wages by the master who had worked him through it, and a year's wages was the whole of what stood between that man's widow and the cold. The master did not want to pay it. The master came to Crale, and Crale, for a clean sum, simply did not enter the stonemason among that season's dead, let his name stay unwritten, let his claim have no corpse to hang from, and the wages debt, with no recorded dead man to be owed to, quietly ceased to exist. And then the widow came to the office. Crale remembered her on the bad nights with a clarity he had never asked for. She had come with her certainty and her folded papers and her 2 children waiting in the cold of the doorway, and she had asked, reasonably, for the office to find her husband's claim in the book. And Crale had been kind to her. That is the part that found him in the dark. He had not been cruel. Cruelty he could perhaps have lived beside. He had been kind. He had sat her down and brought the great ledger and turned the pages with his careful clerk's hands and let her watch him search. And then he had looked up with the exact gentle regret of an honest man bearing bad news and told her there was nothing. No entry, no claim. The records showed her husband owed nothing and was owed nothing, and were the records not the records? She had gone away believing the book before she believed her own marriage. He had made the small true feeling pieces and let her assemble her own ruin out of them, and she had thanked him on the way out. Crale lay in the schoolhouse, 20 years and a country away, and listened to the horse walk, and could not for the life of him stop seeing the doorway and the 2 children in it, and the particular way the smaller one had been holding the larger one's sleeve. He began, that deep in the autumn, to make mistakes. Small ones. A clerk's tells. He miscounted the children's slates one morning and counted them again and miscounted them differently. He stopped taking the field-edge path to the Vant farm, the one that ran near the wall, near the road, and went the long way round through the lane, and told himself it was for the company and knew that it was not. And one grey afternoon, a child in the schoolroom, a small girl chanting the wordless way children chant while they work, was singing under her breath the Senon Hollow skipping rhyme, the one every child there had, the one about the rider. He does not run, he does not run, he counts you while you run. And Crale heard himself, in front of the whole room, tell her sharply to stop. The children went still and looked at him. He never raised his voice. The children had never once heard him raise his voice, and now he had, at a nursery rhyme. That was the day Crale understood that he was not going to outlast it. Not by smiling, not by patience, not by any tool in the trunk. The horse was not getting fewer. The doorway would not stay shut. He had perhaps one move left on the board, and it was not escape. Escape he had already spent. It was anchorage. If he could not outrun the road, then he would put down such roots that the road could not lift him. A farm, a wife, a father-in-law's name over him like a roof, a whole village arranged around him as a man who belonged, who was owed to, who was claimed. A man alone on a road is a debt with legs. A man with a farm and a family and a place in the count is, he told himself, something the road would have to think harder about. He was wrong. The road does not think harder. The road does not think at all. That is the whole horror of it. It only reads. But Crale did not know that yet. And so he put everything he had left onto the one square, and the square was the harvest feast, and the feast was 9 days away. The end of harvest in Senon Hollow was marked every year with a feast at the Vant farm, and that year the feast fell on the last warm night the autumn had left to give. Old Vant kept the feast the way a lonely rich man keeps every occasion, too large, too bright, as if the noise could be banked against the winter. The chapel-sized barn was hung with lanterns. There were 3 long tables of food and a fiddler, and the whole of Senon Hollow came in their good clothes and ate the old man's harvest and danced on his threshing floor. And for a few hours the village kept its back to the bone road and pretended, altogether, that the dark beyond the wall was only dark. Crale came in his best coat. He had been preparing for this night for 2 months. He had decided that the feast was where he would close the matter, that he would, before the evening ended, ask Otmar Vant for Katherine's hand, in the warm and the lantern light, in front of the whole village, where a kind and lonely old man would find it very hard to say no. It was a good plan. It was patient and it was cruel and it read people exactly right. Which is to say, it was a Crale plan, the last one he would ever make. And it might even have worked. I want you to understand that. If the only thing riding towards Senon Hollow that night had been an old man's reluctance, Crale would have won. He would have married the warm house and grown old in it, and the 200 unwritten dead would have stayed 200 lines of nothing in a ledger far away. But there was another thing riding towards Senon Hollow that night, and it had a better claim on Crale than Crale had on the farm. The feast went well for him at first. He danced with Katherine twice. He was charming with the old man. He told the children stories, and the parents watched him be good with the children and did the warm arithmetic that parents do. And then, late, when the food was down to bones and the fiddler had gone soft and slow, the talk by the great fire turned, the way talk in that village always finally turned, to the bone road and to the rider. They told the old stories. The carter who owed his dead brother a stone and never laid it, and was found one morning a mile down the bone road, sitting upright, with no name anyone could remember. The 2 families and the disputed field. the usual catalogue of a village that lives beside a thing and steadies itself by reciting it. And then a drover from the next valley over, a guest, a man with no stake in frightening anybody, said a small thing into a lull, and the small thing changed the temperature of the room. He said, "It's close this autumn, the road. We've heard the horse 3 nights now, our side of the ridge, closer each night. My grandmother would have said the rider had a name to collect near here and was circling it, walking the long way in, the way you do when you're early and certain and in no particular hurry." And Crale, who had spent the whole evening being charming, felt the old cold open under him again, the charnel town cold, the floor of the stomach cold. And this time, with the wine in him and the long good evening behind him and the prize so near, this time he could not get the smile back down over it fast enough. Katrin saw. Katrin had been watching for exactly that all night, the way you watch a frozen pond for the one dark line. She saw the schoolmaster's face come apart for a half-second over a drover's ghost story, and she understood. Not the details, not the ledgers, not the 200, but the shape of it, the size of it. She understood that the man courting her was not afraid of the rider the way a sensible stranger is politely afraid of a local tale. He was afraid of it the way the carter should have been. He was afraid of it because it was his. He found her later, away from the fire, and he made his mistake. He should have waited. A patient man would have waited. The evening had turned. The room was cold with the drover's words. It was not the night to ask. But Crale had felt the prize moving away from him, had felt the whole careful autumn starting to slide, and a frightened man reaches, and Crale reached. He took Katrin Vance's hands in the lantern light, and he asked her, in his good, low, careful voice, to be his wife. And Katrin, and I have always admired her for this, for the steadiness of it, Katrin did not pull her hands away. She let him hold them. She looked at him the way you look at someone you have decided to be honest with, because honesty is the last kind thing left to give them. "No," she said. And then, because she was not cruel, only done, "I have known since the first night what you were looking at my father's table. It was never me. I do not think you have looked at a single thing in your life, Crale, and wanted it for itself. I think you only ever look at things and price them." She took her hands back, gently, and then she said the thing that I believe, of everything said to him that night, was the thing that put him on the road. She said, "Whatever it is that frightened you by the fire, whatever you owe, I hope you pay it. I hope you pay it, Crale, because a man who never pays anything is not a man who got away with it. He is just a man the debt has not finished crossing the room toward."
Then she went back to the light, and the fiddle, and her father, and her life, which went on and was long, and was, I am glad to tell you, mostly good. And Crale stood in the dark at the edge of the warm, and the autumn was over. He did not say goodbye. A humiliated man does not. He went out to the rail where the hired horse was tied, and he climbed up clumsy with wine and with shame, and he turned the horse's head toward the schoolhouse on the far side of the village. The short way to the schoolhouse went through the lane, past the lit windows where there were people. The long way went out the farm's north gate, and along the field edge, and onto the open bone road for half a mile before it cut back in. Crale took the long way. I have asked myself why every time I have told this tale, and I have only ever found the one answer, and it is not a comfortable one. He took the long way because the short way had people in it, and people had just watched him fail, and a proud man in ruins will choose the dark and the dead over one more lit window with a face in it. He chose the bone road to avoid being seen. That is the whole of it. 200 dead men, 9 years, the length of a country run in fear, and in the end, the thing that walked Crale out onto the rider's road was that he could not bear, on the worst night of his life,
to be looked at. The north gate of the Vant farm closed behind him. The lantern light went small and then went out behind the rise. And Crale, alone on a borrowed horse, with the wine going cold in him, came out onto the pale open surface of the bone road in the dark. It was very quiet at first. The bone road at night is not like the quiet road. It does not take your sound from you. It simply does not offer any of its own. No wind to speak of. The horse's hooves on the bone dust made a soft, packed, padded sound, like walking on a floor that has had too much walked on it. The road ran pale ahead of him under no moon worth the name, and the ossuary shrines stood back from it at intervals, stacked and patient, and Crale rode with his shoulders up around his ears and told himself the thing that men have always told themselves on that road. He told himself it was only half a mile. He had gone perhaps a third of it when he heard the other horse. It was behind him. It was not close. It was a long way back down the road, back toward the farm, and it was walking, not galloping, not hurrying, only walking, a slow and even and unbothered walk. And the first thing Crale felt, God help him, was relief, because a walking horse meant another guest, another reveler going home late, a living person on the road with him in the dark. He drew up. He turned in the saddle. He meant to wait for the company. There was nothing on the road behind him. The pale road ran back, empty, to the rise, and the walking sound came on down it anyway, hoof and hoof and hoof, steady, unhurried, growing no louder and no softer. A horse walking toward him along a road with no horse on it. Crale stopped telling himself things. He put his heels to the hired horse, and the hired horse, which had heard the other sound long before Crale had, and had been waiting with an animal's whole patience for permission, broke into a run. And the walking thing behind him, without ever seeming to change its pace. This is the part every telling must get right. This is the horror of the Bone Road's rider. He never hurries. He never has had to hurry. The walking thing behind him kept pace. Crale rode. The half-mile of open road that should have taken him minutes unrolled and did not end. The way distance on the 13 roads does not end when the road has decided it is not finished with you. And the schoolhouse light never came, and the cutback into the village never came, and there was only the pale bone dust pouring under the horse, and the ossuary shrines standing by like patient witnesses, and behind him, always the same distance behind him, however hard he rode, the slow walking hooves of a horse that did not exist. He looked back once. You always look back once. Tovin's uncle taught us that, on another road, and it costs the same everywhere. And the second time Crale looked back, the road behind him was not empty. It was a long way back still. A shape at the limit of the pale road, but it was there now, where for 9 years it had only been a sound. A horseman. A tall, thin horse, the color of weathered bone, and on it a rider robed and hooded, and where the face should have been, there was only the dark inside the hood, and the horse breathed out great slow plumes of mist into an autumn night that was not nearly cold enough to make them. And the rider held, upright against the pale sky, a long iron rod. Crale could not have seen, at that distance, in that dark, whether the rod was etched with anything at all. He saw it anyway, every name on it. 9 years of imagined nights had cut every stroke of it into him already, and his own name worst and deepest of all. And he turned forward again and rode the way a man rides when riding is the only thing left that he has not yet been told is useless. The rider came on behind, walking, patient, closing, not because the rider went faster, the rider never went faster, closing because the bone road, very gently, the way it had unrolled the half-mile, was now folding it back up. And as the road folded, the rest of them came up out of it. I have to tell you about the 200 now, because Crale's last ride was not a ride down an empty road with one rider on it. The bone road does not collect a debt quietly when it can collect it as a lesson. As the rod drew nearer the ossuary shrines that Crale was passing, the patient stacked cairns of femur and shin began, each one, as he passed it, to be occupied. Not by figures, I want to be careful. Not by ghosts standing and pointing, nothing so kind as that. It was only that each shrine, as Crale's running horse drew level with it, was for 1/2 second attended. There was a sense, at the edge of the eye, of a person who had been standing there a very long time, waiting, and who was satisfied now to see him go by. And Crale, riding, knew them. That is the cruelty the road had built into it. He did not see faces and fail to place them. He felt, shrine after shrine after shrine, the specific small recognitions. That one, the widow whose husband's debt he had unwritten so her late husband's brother could take the mill. That one, the drowned man whose claim he had let dissolve. That one, that one, that one. 200 lines of blank ledger, and every line had been, the whole time, a person. And every person had been waiting at a shrine on this road for the night the clerk finally came to walk it. They did not reach for him. They did not have to. They had a rider for that. They only, each of them, watched their one particular debt go by, and the watching was the most terrible part of it, worse than the rider, because the rider was only iron and procedure, and the watching was personal. The rod drew level with him. It came up on his left side, the bone-pale horse, breathing its cold mist, neither hurrying nor straining, simply arriving, the way the conclusion of a sum arrives. And Crale, on his lathered, terrified, failing hired horse, could not outride a thing that had never been running. And at last, because there was nothing else his body knew how to do, he turned his head and looked. The rider had no face. There was the hood, and there was the dark inside the hood, and the dark was not empty. It was attentive. It was turned toward him. It had the quality of a face doing the one thing a face does, which is regard you. But there were no features in it to appeal to. You cannot bargain with a smooth dark. Crale had spent his whole life reading faces and selling to them, and the Bone Road had sent, for him, the one customer in all the world with no face to read. And the rider raised the rod and held it where Crale could see it, almost gently, the way you hold a document up to a man so he can confirm it is his. It was covered, end to end, in names. Cut deep, cut close, hundreds of them, a lifetime of them, the iron nearly more name than iron. And Crale's eye, a clerk's eye, trained, the fastest reader of a list in any town it had ever lived in, Crale's eye went down the rod the way it had gone down 10,000 ledgers, and it found his name with the ease of long practice.
Not Crale. The other one. The first one. The name he had been born under and had worn for 30 years and had buried, he thought, in a grey town at the start of this road. It was cut into the iron near the top. It was an old cut. The edges of it were worn smooth, gentled by weather, by the rod's long carrying. It had been waiting up there, smoothing in the wind, for 9 years. He had run the whole length of the world and arrived exactly at a name with his own face, cut into iron, going soft at the edges from the weight. The rider did not strike him. I told you at the start that the rider never strikes. I want you to see now that it was not a mercy and not a threat withheld. It was simply that striking was not the procedure. The procedure was the reading. The rider lifted the rod a little, the way a man lifts a page toward a lamp, and the dark inside the hood turned the last small degree toward Crale, and the Bone Road, the whole pale length of it, and the 200 attended shrines, and the cold, and the mist, and the folded distance, all of it went very, very still, the way a courtroom goes still, because what came next was the verdict, and everything else had only ever been the trial. And the rider read Crale's name aloud,
I was not there. I want to be honest with you about that, here at the end, because I have been honest with you all the way down. I did not see Crale's last moment. No one did. What I can tell you is what the Bone Road tells every guide who walks it after, the way a house tells you about the family that left, by what is missing and by what is suddenly, newly there. What is missing is Crale, not dead. The Bone Road does not deal in dead. Dead is a thing that happens to people, and a person is what Crale stopped being when the rider reached the last syllable. He was not killed on the Bone Road that night. He was concluded. He was a debt, and the debt was red, and red debts are closed, and closed debts are filed. Here is what was suddenly, newly there. The hired horse came back to the Vant farm at dawn, alone, walking, calm, with nothing on its back and nothing wrong with it. And the men of Sennin Hollow took lanterns and walked the north field edge and out onto the Bone Road in the grey morning. And they found, on the pale dust, Crale's good coat and Crale's hat, set down, not dropped, not torn, set down, side by side, neatly, the way you leave clothes you will not need again. And they found one thing more, and it had not been on that road the day before. A new shrine, a small one, a fresh stacked cairn of pale bone at the road's edge, the bone still faintly damp, raised overnight by the hands nobody ever sees raise them, and set upright into the top of it one long, clean bone. And cut into that bone, fresh, the cut edges still bright, still sharp, not yet started on their 9-year softening, a name. It was not the name on the schoolhouse door. The men of Sennin Hollow stood in the cold morning and looked at a name none of them had ever heard, cut newly into a shrine that had grown overnight beside the road, and not one of them understood what they were looking at. I will tell you what they were looking at. They were looking at the only honest piece of bookkeeping Crale was ever part of. For 9 years, he had taken names out of the record of the dead. And on his last night, the record had simply, patiently, corrected itself, had taken his name out of the rider's iron, off the list of the living who owe, and entered it, properly, in stone, in the count of debts the Bone Road has settled. He was written at last. He had become the kind of line he had spent his life erasing. Sennin Hollow decided in the end that the schoolmaster had run off in the night. It was the easy story, and the village wanted the easy story. He had been refused. He had been proud. The trunk of books was still in the schoolhouse, but a proud man might leave anything behind, and a stranger who arrives from nowhere is allowed, by the arithmetic of small places, to return to nowhere without too many questions. Bram Holt married Katrin Vant the next summer, and it was a good marriage, and the coat and the hat were quietly buried and not discussed.
Only Katrin ever came close to the truth, and she came close the way she did everything, quietly, and kept it. She had told a frightened man by a fire to pay what he owed. She had watched him instead ride out the long way, into the dark, to avoid being seen. I think she knew. I think she lived a long and mostly good life on that warm farm with the road at the foot of the fields. And I think on the nights the horse walked, she lay awake and was glad, fiercely, privately glad, that she had taken her hands back. So, that is the tale, and here is the toll of it. You will be told someday that you have gotten away with something. The voice that tells you this will be your own, and it will be patient, and it will point to the years. Look, it will say, it has been 9 years, it has been 20. The road never came. The thing you did has gone quiet. You did not pay and nothing happened. You got away. Hear me. Nothing going quiet is not the same as nothing coming. A debt to the dead does not expire, and it does not forget your face, and it is not slowed by your changing your name, or your town, or your trade. It is only ever doing what Katrin Vant said it does. It is crossing the room toward you. It crosses at a walk. It never needs to do more than walk.
So if there is something you owe, to the dead, to the living who will one day be dead, to the people whose names you have left for your own comfort, unwritten, pay it now, while the paying is still yours to do, while you can still choose the short way home, through the lit windows, past the faces. Because the rider is already on the road. The rider has always already been on the road. The fire is down to its own bones, and I have a long way to walk before light. And you have been kind to sit up with me this far. Go in. Bolt the door if it comforts you. It is a good habit, and it costs nothing. But understand that the rider does not knock. The rider does not need the door. The rider only needs the name. And the name, I am sorry to tell you, the name you have had all along.